Hey, we are live. Stop the FOMO and welcome to the review of the 2023 Hisense U7K. So we had a live stream yesterday and it appeared at first, wow, this TV felt a little dim in filmmaker mode. It's possible that its ambient light mode was on in filmmaker mode. And then over the course of its break-in period, I came back, I was like, wait, filmmaker mode looks really good. It's like really bright. So today we are going to redo the live stream review. We'll go through the same content, and unlike yesterday, I'm going to be able to explore also Netflix off of my Chromecast. Yes, you guys can see how that is. And we'll go through different brightness content. So if you have any questions about the U7K, let me know. And yes, we will be comparing it to the Q7 at some point next week. But first, let me introduce today's sponsor, Whokeys. Yep, you just finished your big old PC Windows build. You have the best of the best, and sadly, you have less than $20 to your name. Whokeys to the rescue. Use my code SF20 and immediate discount. Let's quickly go through the activation process after you've purchased Windows 10 on Whokeys. Go to your Whokeys account and select My Purchased Orders. See your order. To the far right, click on the button that says View Keys Codes to see the Windows CD code. At the bottom of this order where it says Code Card, to the right is the product key you need to activate Windows. So copy this long number, then go to the Windows menu and click on Settings. In the Settings menu at the bottom, select Update and Security. Select Activation, then select Change Product Key, paste what you copied from Whokeys, click Next, click Activate, and you're done. You can download the Windows 10 Pro key and you're up and running. But that's not all, folks. Whokeys has keys for games too. Steam, Origin, Uplay, you name it, you got it. Check out their sites. There are discounts for all sorts of stuff. And most importantly, you want to be productive? What about Office Suite? Yep, you can download a copy of Office Professional with my code SF20 at checkout, and bam. So just a quick review of the specs. The U7K is the least expensive mini LED you can get in 2023. Street prices are $850, around there. So you'll see MSRP at just above $1,000. Ignore it. Do not pay $1,000 for this TV. Within a few weeks, it will drop to around $849 for the 65-inch size. So that's really great news. Now, to be fair, the Hisense U8H is currently $950. The question is it worth $100 more? Or how about the 2023 TCL QM8? That is above $1,000, close to $1,200. So what are you getting by paying a few $100s more for the QM8 that you're not getting with the U7K? So we're going to explore that today. And many of you may just say, wait, the U8H is great. I'll just get that, right? So we'll see, but I'll have to tell you this. There's at least one thing that U7K does better than the U8H, and I'll show you in the sample. And I think that one thing is important enough that many of you will just get the U7K. Now that's saying a lot, right? And the U7K does have more gaming features than last year's U8H or U7H. The processor is much better, you'll see that. And it has a game bar that looks suspiciously similar to the Samsung game bar. So let's go into the settings real quick. As we go through the settings, you'll see the settings for the comparison with the U8H and the QM8. So U8H on top, U7K on the bottom left, and QM8 on the bottom right. U7K first, and right here we are in filmmaker mode, right? So filmmaker mode, everything is off, automatic light sensor is off, right? And content auto type detection is off. Brightness, local dimming is on high, and I played with it. It doesn't appear to do much. I mean, it slightly gets dimmer, but I always keep it on high. So just as an FYI, if you have an LCD TV with full array local dimming, always leave it on high for the contrast and deep blacks. That's my experience. Now, when you're watching SDR, you may play with it to get it brighter, but what I've found is high is the best image quality for all of these TVs. So local dimming is on high, brightness maximum, because HDR, that's what you want. Brightness should always be maximum. Contrast are left in default, active contrast off, dynamic tone mapping is off, and everything else is off. Dynamic range is on auto, color, default Temperature is on warm 1. This makes it closest to the U8H, and it's pretty good out of the box. So for those who just joined me, the U8H has been calibrated, the U7K has not been calibrated, and the QM8 has not been calibrated. Now let's go to the U8H settings. It should also be in filmmaker mode. Filmmaker mode, backlight, local dimming is on high, backlight's on maximum, auto light sensor is off, filmmaker mode, this all standard, all those calibrated. This is its most accurate. Also warm, 1 color temperature, active contrast is off, dynamic tone mapping off, and all the other crazy stuff is off. Okay, and now for the TCL settings. So interesting, the TCL doesn't have a filmmaker mode per se, and it's really limited to one mode. There is just no other mode other than either movie mode or IMAX, which I do not like IMAX at all. So movie mode with brightness set to max, advanced settings, contrast is max, right? Now, dynamic tone mapping, we're gonna play with that later. There is this one scene where actually it helps the TCL be more accurate. We're going to leave it off because most of the time off, it's actually very accurate. And local contrast is their version of local dimming, so that's on high. Micro contrast is off, and the gamma is at 2.2 because we're in a dark room here. Color, so warm all the way down gives it the most accurate warmth for now. So -5 to warm on the color. And clarity, I just leave it all default. Normally, I don't touch it. Motion clarity, let me just turn that off. There we go. Okay, for context, the U8H was my editor's choice for 2022. It continues to be an amazing TV, especially for HDR watching. It's not perfect, no TV is, and you'll see those imperfections with the U7K, where there's this one scene where you're like, oh wait, wow, it actually bettered the U8H. But overall, the U8H continues to be an excellent TV. The QM8 is the flagship TV for TCL this year. Also an excellent TV, very bright. Both the U8H and the QM8 are arguably the brightest TVs you can get. So we have options. We can do 10,000 nit, but this is unrealistic. What I will do though is when we get the U8K, then we will do 10,000 nit content, U8H, U8K, U7K. But for the U7K, I think it's more realistic to do 2,000 nit content because any content you're going to get, whether it's movies or Netflix or whatnot, rarely goes above 2,000. Now, I do have movies that we're going to test out, and you'll see these movies actually do go above 2,000, and you'll see how the U7K renders those real scenes above 2,000 nits. But for the purposes of this, you know, we might jump to 10,000 here and there, but we'll stick with 2,000 for the most part because that's a fair assessment of the challenging real movie content. And well, you guys will see for yourself. So let's get into it real quick and we'll walk through it. I'll skip some scenes. So right now, right here, as you can see, brightness on the U7K is a touch less bright, especially on the very top where you see that brightness in that cloud on the very top center of the screen, right? Put on my trusty gloves and touch the screen so you guys see what I'm talking about. So right here, brighter on the U8H. But remember, dynamic tone mapping was off. And so this is where dynamic tone mapping comes in. And we're going to play with dynamic tone mapping so you guys can see when to use dynamic tone mapping. So active contrast is off. Okay, right there. Oh, look at that. Suddenly, it's as bright, but what happened? I lost some cloud cover detail, right? It got there, but it lost all that detail. So the question is that important to you, right? So what I'm gonna do is run this scene again with dynamic tone mapping on, and you guys can see whether this affects your viewing experience. Honestly, it looks great because you don't know what you don't know. You don't realize you've lost some cloud detail. I'm gonna pause here though. Mostly because all the details are there. So I think you guys can see the detail. Great tone mapping, 2,000 nit content, nothing is clipped. You can see all the background details. I mean, arguably the QM8 and U8H, slightly darker, the trees in the back, but this is actually pretty good. I mean, it is the U7K after all, but not bad. 2,000 nit, not clipped. You see the cloud? The brightness in the cloud detail. And this is why I have to turn dynamic tone mapping on. Both the QM8 and the U8H, you see that extra brightness? I should point that out. Okay, so right here, we're talking about this part right here, right? Significantly brighter on those two. Here, it's all the same. This is that three-dimensionality we're talking about. When you have that extra contrast popping, it feels like it's popping out at you, and it's even more dramatic in front of me right here. So this is why, more often than not, for HDR content, my recommendation is to turn on, look at that, dynamic tone mapping. Yes, I lost a little bit of detail, but for sure, the pop is there. This is a great one because you can see the brightness, the separation, and you're not losing much detail either, if any, right? It's very close, actually. You're barely losing any at all in this scene. As you can see, there's just a touch that you may lose, one wisp of smoke, but the brightness and depth is there. And even though dynamic tone mapping is on, normally it affects the near blacks and it affects some of that midtone. If I turn up the exposure, you'll see the near blacks are not lifted. And this is what impressed me with this algorithm. The shadow detail on the U7K, identical to the QM8 and the U8H. That tells me that even though the dynamic tone mapping is affecting the image, it's not affecting it globally. It only affects the higher, brighter parts, and it leaves untouched everything below that brightness. That shows some sophistication that I didn't see before, because look at the rest of the scene. It's indistinguishable, right? Which before, everything would be lifted, not this time. So the U7K, better than I expected. And this is, I think, progress for most TVs. They're getting a bit better choosing what to brighten and what not to brighten. And even if I turn it up to 10,000 nits, right, the U7K, the APL, keeps up with the other two TVs. So if you're in a bright room, you're watching sports, right now the U7K is definitely a TV to consider. So as I lower the exposure, this allows me to emphasize and bring to your attention, if there is a TV that's dimmer, it would really stand out with a lower exposure. So lowering the exposure, you can see that the TVs pretty much have the same brightness, right? And the specular highlights on the U8H is a touch brighter, just a touch, and the QM8 also a touch brighter. Of course, the U7K, I mean, it only could do what it could do, right? But still, I had to go to 10,000 nits to get there. Oh, here's a great one. Let me pause here real quick. Okay, so this is an interesting scene. And the reason why it's this interesting is this. The TCL has more orange, more color depth than either the U8H or the U7K. As a matter of fact, U7K, U8H look identical. They're tone mapping this scene the same. The U8H being a touch brighter than the U7K, whereas the TCL is bright, but it preserves that orange. The U8H is the brightest of the three by a touch, but in order to be the brightest, you've lost color luminance. It's diluted. It's more yellow than orange. Whereas the TCL, it preserves the orange luminance, but in return, it's a touch less bright. So this is where dynamic tone mapping comes in. If you prefer the look of the U8H or the U7K, this is when you turn on dynamic tone mapping. And I'm assuming that's what it's going to do. Oh, let's see what happens here. Dynamic tone mapping. So the TCL, unlike Hisense, it raises the brightness a bit. Its range of brightness is a bit more. It doesn't limit its brightness just to the specular highlights. It raises its brightness in the luminance areas also below those specular highlights. So the entire, I don't want to say the entire scene, but more of the scene is bright rather than just limiting it to that specular highlight, which the U7K does. And this is what most TVs do, by the way. So in the analyzer, you know where the brightest part of the scene is, right? If you guys don't know, I'm gonna run out there and point it out for you guys real quick. So this is the luminance right here. This is the brightest part of the scene, which matches to this part, right? So right here, brightest part of the scene. So this is what we're gonna look at. How do they handle it? And it's supposed to be 10,000 nits. That's how it's graded, right? So definitely over 4,000 nits. All the TVs are pushed to their limit right here. This is the spot we're talking about. Why not this part? Because it's white. TVs can do white very easily. Can they do yellow and orange, right? And the ones that cannot has a choice to make. You push more white to get that brightness, but you lose color, or you preserve the color and you don't get it. And now we'll see what the U7K has done with its dynamic tone mapping on or off. Oh, unfortunately, you're not going to see me toggle it. Okay, it's on, right? Let me turn it off, and then you can see how much more of that orange you get back. So the U7K now has as much color as the QM8 and the U8H. However, it's not as bright. You know, no TV is perfect, but it's not terrible, right? But if you want that brightness, turning dynamic tone mapping back on gets you there, but then it's going to be more diluted. You'll get the brightness, but it'll be more white than orange, right? So there you go. See, the brightness is there, but how much have you lost? And this is something that WOLED has to deal with. The G3 does it exactly the same way. The MLA gives you that white brightness, but guess what? You're diluting some of the orange. So we have DTM back on the U7K, so you get that pop. This one is very dramatic, dynamic tone mapping on the U7K. And I'll show you guys. So this is great, right? It's all bright, awesome, awesome. So far so good. And we're gonna get to the part where you have the fluorescent lights. And this is, all right. The U7K keeps up, right? And it's unbelievable how important dynamic tone mapping enabled here. So look at the fluorescent lights. Oh, what is this? SDR, right? Not even close. You gotta turn it on. A completely different image, right? It's like HDR, SDR. That's how dramatic it is in this scene. And I think that alone should be convincing for anyone watching HDR content that's graded bright. You gotta have it on. Oh, so this is one where I really like how the QM8 did this. It is as bright as the others, but there's a lot more detail while it preserves the brightness. So you can see the QM8, there's a gradient, right? The brightest part of that sunset or sunrise, there's a small point, but then it slowly gets, well, there's a lot more detail. The U8H has a jump. It's bright and then it jumps to less bright, whereas the U7K, it's clipping that detail because we have tone mapping on. And so if I recapture that gradient detail by turning off dynamic tone mapping, what you're going to see is that it doesn't pop as much, but it looks similar to the QM8 because it's giving you back that detail. And this is all tone mapping, by the way. That's the biggest difference, right? And again, the U7K, I turned off dynamic tone mapping, so now it looks similar to QM8, recapturing all that detail. So this is up to you guys. When you have a TV, especially the U7K, you play with dynamic tone mapping because sometimes you might prefer that pop that comes from having that wide range. This is why you pay for HDR content. It's to get that dynamic pop, and this is why some people actually prefer projectors because they like the SDR gradients. I'm going to turn it back on. So you see how bright it is now? Oh, this is a great one because now you'll see the QM8 really stand out. Okay, so this brightness, not even the U8H can keep up. So as you can see, this is where the QM8 makes its money, this scene right here. I think you guys can see that it's significantly brighter than the other two, right? So the QM8, this is its next generation TV. Whether it's additional dimming zones, whether it's better processing, whether it's a mini LED thing, it is simply brighter in this content. And this is 10,000 nit content, and the QM8 nails it. And you can see how much brighter the U8H is, right? So the U7K, let me double check, see if dynamic tone mapping is on, because it's clear that the U8H and the QM8 is brighter. And dynamic tone mapping is on. So here is where, if you really want this to be bright, meaning that top of that building, you're gonna have to pay up and upgrade an extra $100 to the U8H, last year's editor's choice, or get the QM8 or get the U8K. But this is it, right? This is pretty bright. The peak specular highlights is just even white, right? So the U7K, even though it's mostly white, still cannot push it as bright in this scene. Same here, you see, right? It's not quite as bright as the other two TVs. So here's another shocker. This is a high APL scene right here. Very bright, full screen, and the U7K nails it. So let me turn down the exposure so I can see the separation between all of them, if there is any. And there isn't. Yes, I know there's a slight magenta tint on the QM8 because it's not calibrated. And look how bright the U7K is in this scene. You are not compromising on brightness at all. If you need full screen content that's bright, U7K Sports, that's it. This is just great. All right, let's check blooming. This is why the QM8 is such a great TV. The U8H was the best blooming control TV of last year, better than the QN900B, the 8K TV, better than the QN90B, and better than the QN95B. But this year, the QM8 bested the U8H. And the U7K is just a little bit behind. So this is what happens. You don't have enough dimming zones, right? The U7K only has 384 dimming zones. The QM8 has like 1,300 dimming zones. And the U8H has like 504 or 508 dimming zones, right? So the dimming zone, the number of dimming zones and the processing separates the three TVs, but the U7K just does not have enough dimming zones to control the blooming. However, look at between the Ferris wheels, the Ferris wheel spokes, right? U7K still did a phenomenal job. Okay, so this is Chromecast. Let's go to Netflix. So this is HDR, basic HDR on The Witcher. I love this scene because two things. One, you get to see the black levels, whether it's crushed or lifted, and it's streaming. And then you can see how it handles HDR in streaming. And Netflix is popular and it's well graded. I like it a lot. So let's turn up the exposure to start. Turn up the exposure. You see that the QM8 has a touch, maybe a touch deeper blacks where it's black. And the U7K slightly lifted blacks in this scene. And of course, you can see the black bars on the U7K a little bit more. So this is where you're paying a little bit extra for the QM8, right? The brightness is a match. So specular highlights are going to be the same. As far as streaming like Netflix, HDR, where you're paying a little extra is for the contrast from the near black levels, right? And the QM8 does that really well. So, and I say that is because of the extra dimming zones. Let's go to YouTube. Oh, look, there's me. Let's do some movies real quick. This allows me to change the resolution a bit. Brightness is a match, right? So this is HDR on Google or YouTube streaming movie. It's a movie that I bought. As far as U7K streaming HDR content, it looks great. I don't see any issues at all. And I've been watching a couple of movies, right? I have Ready Player One as well. But this is a great one because you have the bright scene, and in the bright scene, it keeps up. It's not less bright than the U8H or the QM8. And its black levels are great. See the horses, right? They all have the same black levels. So if I turn up the exposure just a bit, even when I turn up the exposure, you can see that the black levels of the U7K is identical to the U8H, and arguably the QM8 may be a touch blacker, but again, dimming zones, what are you going to do? That's what you're paying for. I'm going to turn down the resolution so we can see if it affects upscaling, right? So it's at 4K. Let's take it down to, I don't know, that's 480p. And I'm looking at, for the most part, it all looks pixelated and bad. Ah, caught it. All right, so dynamic tone mapping. Let's go back to that. Okay, you see dynamic tone mapping is on, right? Let me adjust the exposure real quick for you guys. Okay, is that good? All right. So dynamic tone mapping is on. Look at the detail in the dragon's face and so forth. If you turn it off, you see how you lose some of those highlights? So in an action movie like this, I'd have to leave it on because I want that pop, right? Greatest Showman. This one, you're going to see how black bars are in a real movie that has black bars. Oh yes, nailed it. Okay, let's demonstrate how the black bars are, where the brightness of the scene touches the edge, right? Now, as far as just overall impact, it's a match. Dynamic tone mapping is on, It matches the other two TVs, right? It's a great scene. Most movies are graded like this. But if we turn up the exposure just a bit, you see the differences, right? In this one, all three, the black bars are not perfect, but the QM8 still has the blackest of the black bars. But see, I am convinced that Hisense can fix this, and I'll show you why in the next scene. All right, this is what I'm talking about. This is just craziness right here. There's so much to discuss in this scene. The fire guitar. I was going to show a few things here. Let's see if I could time it. And, there we go. Okay. So, here's the crazy part. You guys look at the U7K. Look at the blackest part of this scene, right? Near the amplifiers. Perfect black. Why can you not do that with the black bars? Like, wait, you could do this. In this scene, you have parts of the scene that you get perfectly black, just like the QM8. So if you look at the QM8, right, everything is exposed up. The black bars are clean, and it's as black as the blackest part of that scene. The U7K, the black bars are lifted, but the blackest part of the scene is blacker. So that means that U7K can do this. It's all about software. And of course, the U8H is blacker than U7K, and last year, easily one of the blackest. The only TV that beat the U8H in terms of black bars was my QN90A, and that's why I was disappointed with the QN90B. The QN90A had blacker black bars than the U8H, but the U8H had higher specular highlights, and that's why I like the U8H. But the U7K actually exceeds the specular highlights of the U8H in that scene, the small specular highlights we're talking about. The QM8 does it both. Blacker black bars and high specular highlights, and that's where the money is going. So we're going to go into specular highlights now, and this is what shocked me the most. U7K, brighter than U8H specular highlights, a match for the QM8. That is impressive to me. Actually, upon closer inspection, it's brighter than the QM8. Shocker. It really is impressive. The U7K, both on my monitor and I'm eyeballing it, it is brighter. The specular highlights, for the first time, I'm getting specular highlights that beat the U8H. I did not expect this from the U7K. The only trade-off is, well, the slightly lifted black bars. Boom. Okay, so as you can see, the U8H has the most detail in that sun. The U7K and the QM8, they both look like they're struggling, right? The U7K is as bright, but it just, without enough dimming zones, it cannot resolve all those details. The contrast is not there. The QM8, however, can do it if I turn on dynamic tone mapping, and this is kind of like a surprise for me, because here is where its dynamic tone mapping helps it if you want that level of detail. So dynamic tone mapping, look, the detail is back. See, it clips some of that detail. So, you know, I'm going to leave it off, but there are some scenes where it really does help. And that's what tone mapping does. Tone mapping is the software trying to give you some of that detail, but every TV does it differently. And with the, let's turn it off so you guys can see what happens with the U7K if dynamic tone mapping is toggled here. It's less bright, like the brightness drops significantly. See that? It's as bright as the U8H, but you lose something. So it's the reverse of the QM8. So you just have to decide what you want to do, right? Now this next one is where the U7K earns its stripes. This is where it beats the U8H, and it's not even close. I'm going to try to capture this. It's basically the color banding issues. The gradient of the U7K from the center of that flare all the way out, perfectly smooth compared to the U8H. The U8H could not render this scene as well, and so you see very fine banding all the way around. You don't see it as well on the YouTube stream, obviously. And the U7K is a match for the QM8. The QM8 also looks pretty good. But the U7K, the fact that it has the same level of processing as the QM8, it tells me that you're getting a lot of TV for the money. So if I turn it up, oh wow, you can really see the banding here. So there you go. Here's the banding problem with the U8H. So this is the difference. That one generation, so a lot of people complain, oh, the Hisense TCL bad processing. Guys, in 1 year, they addressed the banding. And I'm sure they don't even know that Monster Hunter is a problem. They just had a better processor this year. Did Hisense fix the Dolby Vision bug on Netflix? You know, let's try that if you guys have time. Which Dolby Vision mode to use? Generally speaking, Dolby Vision IQ is for brighter rooms, but it relies heavily on the ambient sensor. I didn't find it to work very well. It was a bit too lifted. So I chose Dolby Vision Dark. And of course, dynamic tone mapping does not work in Dolby Vision mode. And on the U7H for apples to apples comparison, we're going to use Dolby Vision Dark as well. And then on the right hand side, we're going to compare Dolby Vision to HDR10. Can you tell the difference? But generally speaking, they are very similar. Unless side by side like this, you're not going to tell the difference. Arguably, HDR10 is slightly brighter here and there. Later, we'll scope these same scenes with a waveform so you can see exactly what the relative brightness is comparing Dolby Vision to HDR10. Let's wrap up my review of the 2023 Hisense U7K. And of course, please click like if you found this review helpful, because YouTube will then spread this video out to others looking for reviews of the Hisense U7K. First and most importantly, if your budget for a 65-inch HDR TV is under $900, this is a must-buy. The U7K is simply awesome for the price. Let's start with the 3 things that definitely impressed me. First, overall brightness. APL full screen, it matches the U7H and QM8. So for sports, broadcast TV, over the air, it works very well. Second, image processing. Many of you had concerns about last year's U7H. Well, the U7K clearly bettered the U7H in those scenes where processing was important. Less color banding, simply a better processor this year. And third, most surprising to me, specular highlights were brighter than the U7H and even the QM8. That's impressive. But ultimately, it is still a value-minded TV. What do you get if you paid a bit more? Let's say for the TCL QM8, its flagship bigger brother, the Hisense U7K or the Samsung Q95C. First, better blooming control. Second, deeper blacks. Those black bars you saw that were a bit lifted with the QM8 or the Q95C and likely the U7K, these black bars will be deep and black. And lastly, I have a question for you all. Were you impressed by the improvements that Dolby Vision content brought to the table? Frankly, I thought they were too close to call, but many of you may prefer Dolby Vision. Were you impressed? And for more TV reviews like the Hisense U7K, the TCL QM8, and more OLED TV reviews, check my videos here and here and here. Until next time, stop the FOMO.